I almost didn't go to the reading. I told myself it was because I had work, because the drive was long, because sitting in a room full of people pretending to grieve my grandfather while mentally dividing up his furniture was not how I wanted to spend a Tuesday. But the real reason was him, my brother-in-law Conrad. And I knew if I walked into that lawyer's office, I was going to have to sit across from him and act like everything was fine. I should have trusted that instinct. My grandfather, Walt, died in October. He was 81, sharp as a tack until the last 6 months, and he left behind a small house in Decatur, a savings account that nobody knew the exact number of, and a family that had been quietly fracturing for 3 years. He also left behind a will that, according to my aunt, had been updated recently. That phrase, updated recently, is the kind of thing that sounds administrative until you realize what it might mean. I'm 32. I work as a physical therapist at a rehab clinic outside Atlanta. I'm not wealthy, but I'm steady. I pay my rent on time, I have a car with no payments left on it, I keep a small emergency fund like my grandfather taught me to when I was 19. He sat me down in his kitchen with a yellow legal pad and drew me a little diagram about compound interest, and I kept that piece of paper in my desk drawer for years. He believed in me in a very specific, practical way that I think I only fully understood after he was gone. My sister Renee married Conrad 6 years ago. I was a bridesmaid. I wore a sage green dress and smiled for 400 photos and said nice things at the rehearsal dinner because I genuinely liked Conrad back then. He was funny in the way that charms people at parties. He remembered details about you, brought them up later, made you feel seen. It took me an embarrassingly long time to realize that was a skill he'd honed for a reason. The first time I felt something was off was about 2 years into their marriage. Renee stopped coming to family things alone. Conrad was always there, which sounds normal, except that Renee had always been the type to show up to our mom's Sunday dinners by herself, eat too much cornbread, and stay until 9 talking. Suddenly she was texting me that they had other plans, or arriving late with Conrad explaining why they couldn't stay long. She started prefacing things with Conrad thinks, and Conrad says, in a way that didn't sound like partnership. It sounded like reporting. I mentioned it once to my mom. She told me not to read into it. That's what my mom does. She smooths. She's been smoothing things in our family for so long that she sometimes smooths over things that really needed to stay rough and visible. But I kept watching. By the time my grandfather got sick, Conrad had become the family's unofficial financial advisor. I don't know exactly when that happened. It crept in the way these things do. He'd mentioned something about estate planning at Christmas, offered to help Grandpa Walt sort through some paperwork, drive him to a meeting with an accountant that nobody else knew about. My grandfather was in the early stages of what we later understood was mild cognitive decline, though at the time we just thought he was tired and grieving my grandmother, who had passed the year before. Conrad positioned himself as helpful. That's the word I keep coming back to. Helpful. The lawyer's office was in a beige building off Peachtree. There was a water cooler in the corner that made a gurgling sound every few minutes. My mom was there, and my Aunt Bev, Grandpa's youngest daughter, and Renee and Conrad, and me. We all sat in chairs arranged in a rough semicircle facing the lawyer's desk. The lawyer's name was Mr. Aldridge. He was maybe 60, reading glasses on a chain around his neck, the kind of man who had probably seen every version of the scene and found it neither tragic nor interesting anymore. I watched Conrad when Mr. Aldridge started reading. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him. He was taking notes. I noticed that and thought it was strange, the way you notice something and file it away without fully understanding why it bothers you. The will divided things fairly straightforwardly at first. Some jewelry to my mom. The old truck to my uncle who lived in Tennessee. And then Mr. Aldridge got to the house and the savings account, and the room shifted. A significant portion, the house and the majority of the liquid assets, had been redirected into a trust. The trust named Conrad as co-trustee alongside my grandfather. It had been amended 14 months before my grandfather died. My mom made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Conrad nodded slowly, like he was hearing something he prepared himself to hear gracefully. Renee was looking at her hands. I said, "When was my grandfather last seen by his doctor before he signed that amendment?" Mr. Aldridge looked at me over his reading glasses. Conrad said, "This isn't really the time." "I'm asking the lawyer a question," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "When was the amendment signed?" Mr. Aldridge gave the date, 14 months ago, as he'd said. March. I knew something about March. In March, my grandfather had called me twice in 1 week, which was unusual for him. He was a once-a-month phone call kind of man. The first call was about nothing, just checking in. The second call, he'd seemed confused about what day it was, asked me twice when my grandmother's birthday was, and then laughed it off. I'd hung up worried and then gotten busy and told myself he was just tired. After the reading, in the parking lot, Conrad put his hand on my arm and said, "I know this is a lot to process." I looked at his hand on my arm. "I'm going to need to see the full trust document," I said. His expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. Here's what I did not do. I did not cry in that parking lot. I did not call my mom and vent for an hour and feel better and move on. I drove home, I sat at my kitchen table, and I started writing down everything I could remember about the past 2 years. Dates, conversations, the accountant meeting nobody was told about, the 2 phone calls in March, the way Renee had looked at her hands. Then I called an elder law attorney. Her name was Miss Tatum, and she was recommended by a colleague at my clinic who had gone through something similar with her own family. Miss Tatum had a calm, methodical way of explaining things that I found steadying. She told me that what I was describing, a cognitively declining elder, a newly inserted co-trustee, an amendment made without family knowledge, was a pattern she saw regularly. She used the phrase undue influence. She told me what we would need to prove it. I want to be honest about something here, because I think people sometimes tell these stories and make themselves sound braver or more strategic than they actually were. The truth is, I was scared. I was scared of being wrong. I was scared of what this would do to my sister's marriage. I was scared of the family dinners that would never be the same, the holidays, my mom asking me why I couldn't just let things be. I lay awake more nights than I can count, running the same questions in loops. What if I'm misreading this? What if I blow everything up and it turns out Conrad had permission, had a reason, had paperwork I don't know about? But I kept coming back to my grandfather's face on those phone calls. The confusion in his voice, and the yellow legal pad Conrad had brought to the will reading. Like he already knew exactly what was coming. Miss Tatum told me to gather records, medical records from March and the months surrounding the amendment, bank records if I could access them, any written communication, emails, texts, from anyone who might have observed my grandfather's mental state during that period. My grandfather, it turned out, had kept a paper calendar, a big desk calendar, the kind with a square for every day, that he filled in with appointments and reminders in his slightly shaky handwriting. My Aunt Bev had it at her house. When I drove out to see her and explained what I was looking into, she went very quiet for a long moment, and then she got up and came back with the calendar. In the square for March 11th, 3 days before the trust amendment was signed, my grandfather had written, in handwriting that was more uneven than usual, "C says sign tomorrow. Don't understand all of it. Ask someone." I took a photo of that calendar page, and my hands were shaking when I did it. Bev sat down across from me at her kitchen table and said, "I thought I was the only one who felt like something was wrong." She wasn't. The medical records were harder to get. I wasn't listed as a healthcare proxy, my mom was. I had to have a very difficult conversation with my mom, the kind where you can see someone wanting to close their eyes and go somewhere else, and you have to keep them in the room with you. I told her what I had. The calendar page, the dates, the pattern, Miss Tatum's assessment. My mom cried. She said she couldn't believe Conrad would do something like that. She said Renee would be devastated. I said, I know. But Grandpa wrote, ask someone 3 days before he signed. She authorized the medical records release. His physician's notes from that period documented what they called episodic confusion, increased repetition, mild short-term memory deficits. The doctor had flagged it and recommended a cognitive assessment. That assessment had been scheduled and then cancelled by my grandfather's family representative, according to the office notes, no name listed. I brought all of this to Miss Tatum. She told me we had enough to file a petition to contest the trust amendment on the grounds of lack of capacity and undue influence. She also made a call, one I hadn't anticipated, to the Georgia Secretary of State's office because as part of her review she'd pulled Conrad's professional registrations. He had, at some point, held himself out as a financial consultant without the required licensure in the state of Georgia. He had done this not just with my grandfather, but Miss Tatum's investigator found with at least 2 other elderly individuals in the past 4 years. One of them had a family who'd complained but hadn't pursued it. Another had died. That detail sat in my chest like a stone. This was not a mistake. This was not one confused moment of bad judgment. This was what he did. The morning the petition was filed, I drove to Renee's house. I hadn't told her what was coming. I want to be honest about that choice too, because it was the hardest part of all of this, and I go back and forth on it still. I told myself I was protecting her from having to choose, from having to warn him, from the impossible position of being both my sister and his wife. Maybe that was true. Maybe I was also, on some level, protecting myself from having to see her face when she heard it. She opened the door in her bathrobe, holding a mug of coffee. She looked at my face and she said, "What happened?" I told her. She didn't speak for a long time. I sat across from her at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd served me pasta twice a week when I was 26 and going through my own bad year, and I watched her process it. She went through several expressions that I couldn't fully name. Not quite shock, more like the look of someone who has been handed confirmation of a fear they've been working very hard not to name. Finally, she said, "The appointment he cancelled." I said, "What appointment?" "Grandpa's cognitive assessment. Conrad told me it was Grandpa who didn't want to go, that he called and cancelled it himself." She set down her mug. I believed him. That sentence, I believed him, the weight she put on it. I reached across the table and held her hand. The court process took 8 months. I won't pretend it was clean or simple. Conrad hired an attorney and contested everything. There was a period of about 6 weeks where Renee didn't speak to me, and I ate dinner alone more nights than I want to admit, second-guessing every choice I'd made. My mom went back and forth. Bev was steady. Miss Tatum was steady. I tried to be steady. What unraveled Conrad in the end was not the calendar page, though that mattered. It was the paper trail that Miss Tatum's investigator pulled together across all 3 families he'd inserted himself into, a pattern of identifying elderly individuals with some cognitive decline, establishing himself as a trusted helper, and redirecting assets through trust amendments or account changes before families realized what was happening. In one case, he'd been named beneficiary on a life insurance policy that the elderly man's own son hadn't known existed. The Georgia Attorney General's office opened an investigation. Elder financial abuse is a felony in Georgia when the value exceeds a certain threshold. My grandfather's estate exceeded it significantly. Conrad was arrested on a Tuesday morning. I found out from a news alert on my phone while I was in between patients at the clinic. I went into the break room and stood next to the coffee maker for a minute. The trust amendment was voided. The house and my grandfather's savings were redistributed according to the original will. My mom got what he'd intended for her to have. Bev got what she was supposed to get. A portion was put into a fund for my grandfather's grandchildren, which he'd specified in the original document, and which Conrad had quietly removed in the amendment. Renee filed for divorce 4 months after the arrest. We talked on the phone the night she made the decision, and she said something I've thought about a lot since. She said, "The worst part isn't that he fooled me. The worst part is that I was so afraid of looking like I'd made a mistake marrying him that I stopped letting myself see the things that were right in front of me. I didn't say anything because I didn't think she needed me to. I still have my grandfather's yellow legal pad, the one with the compound interest diagram he drew for me when I was 19. I found it in a box at my mom's house when we were clearing things out after the estate settled. His handwriting is careful and neat on it, the handwriting of a man who believed precision was a form of respect. He taught me that. To pay attention, to write things down, to ask the question even when the room goes quiet. I think about that calendar square a lot, don't understand all of it. Ask someone, he was asking. He just didn't have anyone in the room who was safe to ask. I'm glad I could be that person. even if it was too late to matter to him directly. I think it mattered to him in some other way that I can't fully articulate. The way that doing right by someone after they're gone can still be a kind of conversation with them. That's the only way I know how to explain why I kept going when it would have been so much easier to stop. I keep thinking about that calendar square. The handwriting slightly uneven, the question mark at the end, like he was reaching out to someone who wasn't there yet. Don't understand all of it. Ask someone? My grandfather was a precise man. He drew diagrams on yellow legal pads. He didn't write things down unless he meant them. That question mark wasn't confusion. It was a signal. And the fact that nobody answered it in time is something I'll carry for the rest of my life. But here's what I've come to understand. The people who do what Conrad did don't succeed because they're exceptionally clever. They succeed because the rest of us are conflict averse. We smooth. We give the benefit of the doubt one more time, and then one more time after that until the window closes. Conrad counted on that. He read our family accurately and moved accordingly. That's not brilliance, that's predation. And the only thing that stops it is someone deciding that their discomfort matters less than the truth. That decision is harder than it sounds. I want to be clear about that. There was nothing heroic about how I felt driving to Renee's house that morning. I was terrified. I loved my sister and I was about to hand her something she couldn't unhold. The courage required wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a single moment of standing up in a courtroom and delivering a speech. It was 8 months of showing up to meetings, answering Miss Tatum's emails, sitting with uncertainty and not letting myself believe the easier version of events just because it would have cost me less. That's the thing about integrity that nobody talks about. It's not a feeling. It's a practice. You don't feel righteous when you're doing it. You feel tired and unsure and sometimes very alone. Bev was steady. Miss Tatum was steady. But there were weeks when I had to be steady for myself, with no external confirmation that I was doing the right thing. Just the memory of a question mark on a calendar page. And the intelligence piece, and I mean this practically, not abstractly, was learning to read the pattern instead of the moment. Each individual thing Conrad did could be explained away. The trust amendment, the cancelled appointment, the yellow legal pad at the reading, none of it was a smoking gun on its own. What made it visible was stepping back far enough to see the shape of it. That's a skill. It can be learned. You ask questions, you write things down. You find the person who has seen this before and you listen to them carefully. Renee said the worst part was having been so afraid of looking like she'd made a mistake that she stopped seeing what was in front of her. I think about that constantly. Pride, the defensive, self-protective kind, is maybe the most expensive thing we carry. It cost her years. It nearly cost our family my grandfather's home and his final wishes. What I know now is this. The people we lose don't need us to grieve loudly. They need us to pay attention while they're still here, and to fight clearly when something is wrong. My grandfather asked someone. I just needed to be the someone who finally answered.